there's no justice like homegrown justice. In Africa, in the 1600s, like I've mentioned before, there were people talking about slavery and how it was mixed up with race, associating slavery with being black. Now, this was obviously disputed way before the 1600s by people like Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun, and so many Al Masudi, and so many other Islamic scholars who were both Ethiopic or Sudanic and non African people who sat there and gave their reasons for why this must not be the case. But one put a lot of effort into making sure that this would happen, and his name was Ahmed Baba al Timbuktu. He wrote a letter, which is what I showed in the first place, to another Sudanese in which he confirms the seriousness in which they will take disassociating slavery with blackness. Now, I want to state he was not against slavery completely, he just was against the idea that slavery and blackness went together. And as a Muslim, of course, he couldn't believe such a thing. Why would enslaving black Muslims make sense? And many Muslims would refer to this over and over again, whether they were black or white. Now, we have to first do some groundwork, which most scholars today agree that prior to Islam, there is no belief to think that slavery and being black was connected anywhere on earth prior to Islam, and that no one in recorded history has any proof that this happened. And so it is true that starting with the era of Islam, there was a growth in opinion. And remember, there was a freedom, and even secular states, but there were a freedom to believe what you wanted to believe, even racist ideas, which they mentioned. There was a sort of freedom of speech way before the American system became a thing. And this is what they had to compete against. Some of you will remember me using the word mujadid, especially to refer to a Mali leader in the past who was referred to by one of the other Muslims from North Africa as a mujadid because of his efforts to stick directly to Islam, and so he was called a mujadid. But this other guy was also called a mujadid, and the reason he was called this was because of his emphasis on law and justice outside of just race. But the race stuff of justice helped dramatically to put him in a position where he would be considered a sort of renewer or reformer to the old ways of Islam. So before we talk about the racial stance that he holds, obviously there's the rule that you can't enslave someone if they're Muslim, which is something that he enforced as one of those rules that you can't just enslave someone if they're Muslim because that would go against everything about Islam. And they'd obviously be like, why be a Muslim if you're just going to be a slave? And what happened was he wrote down that it should be impossible, no matter what country you come from, for you to be a slave if you're a Muslim under a Muslim rulership, under a Muslim governorship. And so he covered that base by doing that. The second one was that you can't enslave someone because they're black. Now, there had been a problem in that people were being enslaved no matter what their race was. It didn't matter. But there'd been a problem that people were starting to associate the curse of Ham with black people, and they started noticing that people are now growing, overgrowing in their mentality and taking over certain schools of learning with this, and it was starting to be taken as a default until it was challenged. Now, unfortunately, even though it was challenged in the East, it continued into the West, and the people of the West just copied the idea. Now, you know the idea was copied because it's not even accurately translated in the books of worship. I mean, if you look at the English translation of what is written and everything, it clearly doesn't say what it's supposed to say. So they took an already broken thing and then they added to that something that's broken in an extra way. But obviously, we know the history of the West didn't just go away, like, or it wasn't an unpopular opinion like it was in the Islamic states. It was something that was not going to go away. In fact, it defied it sort of became defined the rest of the Western history from that point on to the to till today. We still battle with it today. We know how it still affects us in presidential races and how everything works. It still affects us today. Now there is a similar Ahmed Baba on the other side of Africa, but we're not going to talk about that Ahmed Baba today. So the one we're talking about, in order to specify, is from Mali, and he's a black guy from Mali, and he's part of the Sanaja Berbers. And everything I'm mentioning, he's even though he's talking about it from a wide view lens and he's looking at it from the top, he clearly is not look he's clearly not looking at it as if these people are separate from him. In fact, we can see in many, especially modern texts, that it's quite obvious that there was no real line between the Berbers when all comes down. Like, no one who looks at the Sanaja or any of the Fulani or any of these other people can easily tell which ones are the real ones, even if they're Arabic. You can tell usually by them saying, like, yeah, he was married to an Arab or something like that, who's outside of that Sanaja. But if you're Sanaja, they just refer to you as Sanaja. And the only time they bring up race, like in these cases, if it becomes a real problem, which has happened from time to time, because, some of these Arabs were extremely racist. This man clearly deserves a hour-long video, but he's not going to get one so far because I first want to lay down the land of the types of people we're dealing with. I could show you manuscript after manuscript, but I don't think that's going to help when it comes to showing how many people that these people are not shadows. That's what I want to show, that they're not, identities that cannot be revealed as individuals in their own right, where you can go, oh, this guy was happy, sad, and all that stuff. This guy wrote a bunch of books. Those books have been translated into English. You can easily read them online. So, yeah, that's why I talked about him.